You know, it is a really strange quirk of the English language that if you find my argument completely incomprehensible and you throw your hands up saying, it's Greek to me, you are actually quoting a 16th century playwright.
Yeah, you are.
Right. Or if you reminisce about your youthful inexperience like salad days, or say your keys have seemingly vanished into thin air, or even if you've ever been consumed by green-eyed jealousy, you are quoting Shakespeare.
It's deeply embedded. I mean, we walk around using his 20,000 word vocabulary all day long.
Yeah.
And we're mostly blind to the fact that we're even doing it.
Which is really the perfect jumping off point for today's deep dive. Because we don't just borrow a handful of catchy idioms from Shakespeare. When you look at the last 100 years of literary history, it turns out we actually use his plays as this massive societal mirror.
Really do.
And to unpack this, we have a really compelling stack of sources in front of us today. We're pulling from this incredible paper by Dr. Jasmine Rathard on a century of critical revaluation, some frameworks from Walter Cohen, and a book by Ismail Sarajeldin, which features a foreword by the Nobel laureate Ol Soyinka.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is that what stands out across all these texts is a unified theory. Basically, Shakespeare doesn't stay relevant just because he wrote beautiful sonnets. He survives because the way we interpret his work constantly mutates, to reflect whatever we happen to be terrified of or hopeful for at any given moment in history.
So we are going to track that mutation today. We're going to look at how critics have continually rewritten what Shakespeare essentially means and what that century of constant flux reveals about the worldview that you hold today. Because, well, to start, Dr. Rathod makes this really provocative claim that Shakespearean criticism is basically a laboratory for Western literary theory.
Right, it really is. We project our own era's neuroses right onto his characters. And Rathod tracks this starting around 1890, so the late Victorian and Edwardian era. The critical consensus back then was all about this idea of the omniscient bard.
Okay, I just picture that as the very traditional, almost stuffy textbook version of Shakespeare.
Oh, it absolutely was.
Yeah.
Critics back then, like A.C. Bradley, they treated the plays as these grand pedagogical moral lessons. They read them as universal psychological case studies.
Just focusing on the hero.
Exactly. The whole focus was on the noble hero and his fatal flaw. And it assumed a world with a fixed moral center. Because Victorian society perceived itself as having hegemonic stability, meaning, they felt the world had a clear, dominant order that just made sense. So they decided Shakespeare was this master who faithfully mapped out that moral order.
But the luxury of believing the world makes perfect moral sense completely shatters the second we hit 1918. I mean, you have the trenches, the mustard gas, the completely unprecedented mechanized slaughter of the First World War.
Yeah, and that kind of psychological whiplash completely changes the way people read art. You can no longer look at a play and say, yes, a steady march of moral progress, when Europe has literally just torn itself apart.
Right.
The trust in grand, comforting narratives just died. So a new group of scholars, often called the new critics, steps up. And they demanded a total purification of how we analyze literature.
I want to focus on this for a second because it leads to one of the most surprising claims in the sources. T.S. Eliot, who is obviously one of the most famous poets of the era, he looks at Hamlet, which most people consider the absolute crown jewel of English literature, and he publicly calls it an artistic failure.
He did. It was a huge statement. He claimed the play lacked an objective correlative.
Okay, I have to stop you there, because objective correlative is one of those academic terms that sounds incredibly intimidating. What does Eliot actually mean by that?
It is a bit dense, I know, but the concept is fascinating. So Eliot believed that if a character is experiencing a massive emotion on stage, the playwright has to provide a set of objects, or a situation, or a chain of events that objectively justify that emotion.
Okay.
So if the emotion is a 10, the events causing it need to be a 10.
Okay.
Eliot's argument was that Hamlet's disgust and despair over his mother's quick remarriage are just entirely out of proportion to the actual events in the play.
Oh, wow. So he's saying Hamlet is overreacting based on what's actually on the page.
Exactly. Hamlet's angst is a 10, but the plot is only giving him a 5. Therefore, Eliot argued, Shakespeare failed mechanically.
So Eliot is completely stripping away the idea of Shakespeare as this moral philosopher or a godlike genius. Yeah. He's critiquing him purely as a technician of language and structure.
Which was totally revolutionary. And you see others joining in, like G. Wilson Knight, who basically told people to stop reading the plays as linear timelines. He argued we should view them as spatial maps.
Spatial maps, like looking at the whole thing at once.
Yeah. Instead of following a plot from point A to point B, you step back and look at the play like a painting. mapping out the recurring symbols and imagery. It's a very fractured, highly analytical way of processing text, and it was born directly out of a fractured post-World War I worldview.
It makes complete sense that a broken world would want to break down art into smaller mechanical pieces like that. But reading through the timeline, the reaction to the Second World War goes in the complete opposite direction. From 1945 through the 1950s, you have the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, just immense global trauma. But instead of more deconstruction, society seems desperate for a hug.
Yeah, they really needed reassurance. The psychological wreckage of World War II made people terrified of chaos. Consequently, you get critics like E.M.W. Tilliard, who begin looking at the exact same plays and suddenly discover that Shakespeare is the ultimate defender of traditional social structures.
A total 180.
Right. They focus heavily on overarching themes of order versus chaos. They talk about the Elizabethan world picture, which is this idea of a divinely ordained chain of being where absolutely everything has its proper place.
I keep thinking about this like a historical Rorschach test. The Victorian critics look at the inkblot and see a strict moral teacher. The World War I critics look at it and see a mechanical puzzle of symbols. And then the World War II critics look at the exact same inkblot and see a desperate plea for cosmic order and tradition.
That's a perfect analogy. It highlights that the living bard is not a static historical figure at all. He is a dynamic cultural construct. We just rebuild him whenever we need something new.
Which brings us to 1968, where the concept of a comforting cosmic order just gets thrown out the window. The Cultural Revolution hits, the theory era begins, and the Rorschach inkblot morphs again.
This is where we see the rise of new historicism and cultural materialism. This is driven by scholars like Stephen Greenblatt and Walker Cohen. And actually, just as a quick aside for you listening, our goal today isn't to debate or endorse the specific politics of these theories.
Right, definitely not.
We are impartially tracing how modern scholars picked up these politically charged lenses, like Marxist, feminist, and post-colonial frameworks, as historical tools to crack open these texts and drastically alter their meaning. We're just reporting on the history of the criticism.
Exactly. And it is a massive pivot in that history, because before this, everyone was staring at the noble, tragic hero. Now, the lens swings entirely toward the margins. They start asking, what about the people who don't have power in these plays?
Yeah, the focus shifts from the hero to the other. You see a whole wave of feminist and post-colonial scholarship rereading works like The Tempest or Othello. They center characters who were historically sidelined in the criticism, people like Caliban, Sycorax, and Desdemona.
Because they want to see if Shakespeare is defending the power structures or attacking them.
Precisely. The scholars begin asking if Shakespeare was upholding early modern colonial and patriarchal structures or secretly undermining them.
Now, I understand the desire to examine those power dynamics, especially given the social upheaval of the 1960s and 70s, but I have a genuine question about this approach. Because the sources bring up deconstructionist critics like Terry Eagleton. If every new generation just projects their own political anxieties onto a 400-year-old text, breaking gorgeous poetry down into endless politicized semiotic puzzles, doesn't the art itself get lost? Like, don't we just reduce a masterpiece into raw material for academic arguments?
That is a very valid concern, and honestly, you are far from the only one asking it. The author of our main source today, Ismail Sarageldin, raises that exact objection.
Oh, he does?
Yeah, he warns that we risk taking inspiring, deeply human art and reducing it to something brazenly non-historical, just to fuel specialist discourse. To prevent that, Sarageldin insists we have to ground our interpretations in the gritty historical reality of Shakespeare's actual life.
And his actual life was far from the polished academic environments where these plays are studied today.
Worlds apart. I mean, the Elizabethan theater was not a pristine cultural institution. The playhouses were extramural.
Meaning they were physically built outside the city walls?
Literally outside the formal jurisdiction of the London city authorities. They were set up across the Thames in these ambiguous zones, right next to the brothels and the bear-baiting pits.
Not exactly high society.
No, not at all. The playwrights themselves were at the bottom of the social ladder. They were sometimes legally classified alongside vagabonds and even denied Christian burial. And yet, because of the staggering popularity of the plays, these societal outcasts were occasionally summoned to mingle with the monarch and the nobility.
It is such a bizarre social collision. You have this lawless physical space run by people at the bottom rungs of society, but they have the ear of the absolute top of society.
Yeah.
And the audience standing in the pit is a complete cross-section of everyone in between.
And that physical environment created a uniquely licensed space.
Hmm.
In those extramural theaters, subversive behavior and the intermingling of strict social classes were pretty much expected. The playwrights could draw on aristocratic ideas and dirty street jokes in the exact same breath.
Mm. Right.
So knowing this historical reality gives a lot of weight to the idea that Shakespeare's works were inherently designed to challenge the status quo, because the very ground the stage sat on was a geographical loophole in the status quo.
So if we accept that he had this historical license to be subversive, I want to see how that actually functions inside the poetry. Sarah Geldin proposes a framework he calls the new reading to analyze some of the more uncomfortable threads in the plays. Let's apply that, maybe starting with the foreword to his book by Wool Swinka, which focuses on Othello.
Okay, yeah. So Swinka argues that centuries of critics have completely misread Othello by treating it as a standard psychological study of jealousy. He says if you only look at the jealousy, you completely strip away the societal context of who Othello is in Venice.
He's the ultimate outsider.
He is doubly estranged. Soyinka points out that the true foundation of Othello's tragedy is his acute awareness of his status as a black man in an insular white Venetian society. He is possessed by a fatal ambition to prove his worth.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, Soyinka uses a brilliant phrase here. He says Othello is desperately trying to demonstrate his credentials to be an honorary white.
Wow, that reframes the entire emotional core of the play. It isn't just a universal flaw in his personality, like the Victorians would say. It's the crushing, specific psychological weight of trying to assimilate into a power structure that uses his military skills but will never truly see him as an equal.
Exactly. And Sarah Geldin takes this same analytical approach, this new reading, and applies it to The Merchant of Venice, completely rejecting the orthodox view of the play.
The orthodox view being that it's just a light romantic comedy featuring Shylock as the archetypal greedy villain.
Right. Sarah Geldin argues that if you just read Shylock as a two-dimensional bad guy, you are ignoring a massive subversive counter-voice pulsing underneath the entire narrative. The new reading views the play as setting the ideal of humanism against a deeply hypocritical, racist, and sexist Venetian society.
The loudest moment for that counter voice is obviously Shylock's famous speech. It's often quoted as this universal plea for the humanity of oppressed minorities. You know, hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions.
That's an undeniable indictment of discrimination.
It is. But reading the sources, what really stands out is the final line of that speech, the part that usually gets glossed over. Shylock says, "The villainy you teach me, I will execute."
That line is the linchpin. The sources argue that Shylock's demand for a pound of flesh isn't some monstrous anomaly. It is a deliberate, grotesque mirror held up to the Christians' concealed real nature. Shylock is taking the ruthless values that Venice operates on and weaponizing them against the Venetians themselves. He pierces their polite facade.
And Sarah Geldin highlights this incredible detail in the courtroom scene that proves this perfectly. When Shylock is asked to justify his brutal demand for the pound of flesh, he doesn't just invoke the strict letter of the law. He turns to the Venetian nobility and indicts them for their normalized cruelty. He points out that they own slaves.
Yeah, he says, "You have among you many a purchased slave, which like your asses and your dogs and mules, you use in abject and in slavish parts, because you bought them."
It is such a chilling argument. He is basically telling them you buy and sell human bodies. You treat people like animals and justify it by claiming ownership under the law. So by the exact same moral and legal logic that your society is built on, this pound of flesh is mine because I bought it.
It forces the audience to squirm. Shylock exposes the institutionalized horror of their everyday norms. He shows the Venetians that they are every bit as ruthless as he is. They just hide their brutality behind polite laws and aristocratic titles. You completely miss that profound subversive critique if you only read the play as a comedy about a villain getting what he deserves.
It's a prime example of why he survives. He forces us to look at the fundamental mechanics of being human and whether a society has the right to strip that humanity away from anyone. That feels incredibly modern, yet it's wrapped in 16th century blank verse.
Which brings us to the final evolution in Dr. Rathod's timeline. We've moved from the physical theaters of Elizabethan London to the Victorian moralists, the post-war traditionalists, and the 1968 political subversives. Now, we arrive at the present day, looking at American research trends from 2020 to 2024.
Okay, so we are officially in what Rathod calls the post-theory era, and the Bard has become fragmented.
The fragmented Bard. It is being driven by two massive shifts in how we consume information. The first is digital humanities.
This is where we stop just reading the text and start computing it, right?
Precisely. Scholars are using algorithms to scrape the plays. They're counting word frequencies, tracking linguistic drift over decades, and using computational analysis to uncover hidden patterns of co-authorship. Yeah, they are breaking the poetry down into raw data points to see the invisible scaffolding of the language.
And the second driver pulling the text apart is performance studies. This is the argument that staring at a printed page in a library is no longer the way to find the real Shakespeare. The written word is just a blueprint.
The real text only exists in its infinite global adaptations. Performance studies focuses heavily on how the Global South recontextualizes these plays entirely. It looks at massive cinematic translations, like Akira Kurosawa's masterpiece Ran.
Which is an adaptation of King Lear, relocated to feudal Japan, told through visually stunning samurai warfare.
Exactly. And the fact that the emotional core of King Lear completely survives being transplanted into an alien culture in a different language through a visual medium, it proves the point. The focus is no longer on what Shakespeare originally intended on his Elizabethan stage.
You know, when you zoom out and look at this entire century of constant flux, from searching for moral lessons to spatial maps to algorithmic data points, it feels like we aren't even talking about a historical playwright anymore.
And that is the synthesis of all these sources. Shakespeare survives because his work is infinitely plastic. Today, Shakespeare is less a historical person and more a language unto himself. He's a vast system of signifiers that we constantly, relentlessly recode to suit our shifting definitions of justice, of art, and of humanity.
A system of signifiers. It is an unbroken chain of appropriation. We take his words and use them to build the mirror we need for that specific decade.
So the next time you engage with a piece of classic media, whether you are reading a novel from the 1800s, watching a beloved black and white film, or sitting in a theater for a new production of a play, it's worth asking yourself a question. Are you really seeing what the original creator intended? Or are you just seeing your own era's anxieties, your own hopes reflected back at you?
Are you analyzing the ink blot, or are you just analyzing yourself? It completely changes how you interact with art.
It forces you to be an active participant rather than a passive consumer.
And it leaves us with one final lingering thought to mull over, one that wasn't explicitly solved in the research today. If computational tools are currently parsing his language into pure mathematical data and global adaptations are endlessly reshaping his characters in ways that leave the printed page completely behind, will there come a point where the original text of Shakespeare becomes completely obsolete? Will his written words eventually vanish into thin air, replaced entirely by a collective, continuously updated, crowdsourced version of his ideas? Because if the core truth survives without a single original syllable, maybe that is the ultimate proof of his genius.
It is a profound possibility to consider.
Something to think about the next time you realize you're quoting him. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.